As the southern half of Australia enters winter, rather reluctantly it must be said, Supercars are headed north for their annual trip to Darwin and Hidden Valley Raceway, which plays host to round 5 of this year's championship. I'm here to tell you everything you need to know ahead of the Supercars action this weekend, but before we jump into that, a quick note: we have suffered our first mechanical failure of the weekend with my green screen suffering an unfortunate fate. So while I wait for the replacement, please excuse the lack of polish in the production, but let's get into it. As I said at the top, it's Hidden Valley Raceway that plays host to the championship this weekend. A great little track, a bit of a bull ring that doesn't have much in the way of elevation, but it does have plenty of character and a really unique charm, and I love our annual visit to this location. It's a road course that goes in an anti-clockwise direction. It's about 2.9 kilometers in length, or 1.8 miles, with 14 corners, and I'd say the risk rating around here is on the medium end of things. The lap gets underway with a big long run into the first corner, a very long left-hander, a bit of the opposite of Barbagallo that we just visited at the last event. After that, things get quite tight through turns 2, 3 and 4, and that feeds you up to turn 5, an almost 90-degree right-hander that can encourage some overtakes. After that, the field stacks up into turn 6, a hairpin off to the left side before you try and run side by side through turn 7. The final sector has quite a few flicks and turns that aren't really worth noting all that much, so I'll call out the major corners. We've got turn 10 and 11, which are quite fast off to the left, before 13 sets you up very quickly for the 14th and final corner, which sets you up for a very important run onto that long straight. In terms of spots to watch, I'm going to skip over turn 1, which we just know is a action hotspot around here. Instead, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to turns 2, 3 and 4, a very fast combination that doesn't look like much on paper, but when the cars are going side by side through here, especially on lap 1, we actually see some carnage and quite big accidents with not too much runoff on either side of the road. The other spot to call out, I've already mentioned it, turn 6, the field does indeed stack up here, and you can also see some late lunges and overtakes as well. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but this is one of those corners that just seems to tempt drivers into some desperate moves. And then the final corner I will shout out is turn 11. We didn't see much of it last year, but this place has actually seen some pretty major accidents, especially in practice and qualifying. Once again, there's not huge amounts of runoff here, and cars can often lose the back end and find themselves in the wall. Despite being a super sprint event like the last one in Wanneroo, the format is actually quite different this weekend. The action gets underway still on Friday though, with practice 1 at 12:05 PM Australian Eastern Standard Time, before qualifying actually takes place later that afternoon. On Saturday, we have practice 2, a short session to kick things off in the first day of racing, followed by a top 10 shootout, which is always a highlight around any circuit later that day, and our first race of the weekend, 48 laps starting at 3:40 PM Australian Eastern. It's a similar story on Sunday, but we've got a qualifying session kicking things off there, followed by another top 10 shootout, and of course another race of equal distance to finish off the event. The weather isn't going to knock anyone over with a surprise. It is exactly what we go to Darwin for at this time of year. Sunny all 3 days is currently forecast and around that 30-degree mark. So what have been the key Supercars headlines since the last event? Well, we'll kick off with some business news because Supercars released their financial performance from the recent past, and it was a bit hard to follow, but it sounds ultimately like they have made a loss of a few million. Not all that surprising to me, to be honest with you, given the huge investment that's come with Gen 3. I understand that the teams were loaned money to help them through the transition. They've obviously sent the cars over to America for the aero testing and loads of hopefully one-off expenses. So I personally, I'm not all that concerned about that news, but I'm sure someone with far better insight into corporate finance can give a better judgment than me. As part of those financial results, they did give us some strong indication of where the calendar's headed in future years, and it sounds like we will have 2 extra events in 2026. That's fantastic. We're crying out for more racing, and it sounds like Queensland Raceway is an almost certainty to return to the calendar, and it'll be interesting to see what the second event might be. I would suggest Winton is probably the other likely candidate. The Endurance Cup is also rumored to be returning in 2026. For those unacquainted, the Enduro Cup tallied up the points scored over the 3 endurance events in the past. That was historically Sandown, Bathurst, and the Gold Coast, and whoever had the most most points within that portion of the championship with their co-drivers involved would get a separate trophy. It was a great little part of the series, added some extra weight to the non-Bathurst rounds of the Enduro Championship, so I'll be pleased to see that one return. Looking more at the events in the near future though, the Adelaide 500, the season finale, is looking like an absolute bumper show. It was announced over the past week that they will have Supercross and sprint cars in the event's venue, racing in the evenings throughout that weekend. That is just such a cool concept to see different forms of motorsport converging in one place. And yeah, if you haven't seen sprint cars before, as a West Australian who is lucky enough to see them on the regular here at the Perth Motorplex, I cannot recommend them enough. It's not just that though, the Stadium Super Trucks, the Jumpy Trucks as some know them, are returning to Australia, starting off at the Adelaide 500. Their only confirmed appearance at this stage, but I would be very surprised if the cars, or the trucks rather, came all this way for one event. Fingers crossed that means we see more of them at more Supercars events in 2026 as well. On the driver side of things, Cameron Waters has confirmed he will be racing for Tickford in 2026. This was amid speculation that he could go elsewhere within the Supercars paddock, or perhaps even over to America and try out NASCAR a bit more seriously than his one-off appearance over the recent days. I'm sure Tickford are happy that their ship looks stable for the foreseeable future at least, and something we can all be happy about is the return of Track to Town this weekend. This is that great concept we saw in Topor just a few months ago, where their supercars literally go from the racetrack into the center of town, cruising in a nice big convoy. It's a great initiative, and if you've seen Brad Jones's video explaining some of the lengths they're going to keep the cars cool during that journey, you'll know it's no mean feat. So yeah, props to Supercars for this great initiative, and good to see it continuing throughout the season. As for Gen 3 Watch, the cars continue to evolve, and it does feel like we're entering more of a refinement phase than a fixing phase with these machines, which is good to see. This weekend we'll see a change with rear brake blanking allowed during the race. This is just a bit of a minor change to the tech regs. Nothing going to be too noticeable, I think, to us as fans. It just sounds like it will make the rear brake temperatures a bit more consistent during the races. Looking further ahead, it sounds like transient dyno testing will take place in America prior to Bathurst this year. This isn't confirmed, but if it is indeed the case, it's great news. I didn't think transient dyno testing would take place until after the season. So if they can get that under their belt before the biggest race of the year, once again, it will just add to the confidence I think we can all have as fans. And then finally, it was hinted that they're going to look at possibly reducing the weight of the cars in future years. Gen 3 didn't come in as light as everyone expected, and I for one would love to see them take a bit of weight out of those vehicles to help them race better. So what are some of the storylines to follow this weekend? Well, as many fans will know, it's the Indigenous round of the championship, and that sees the teams actually adjust the paintwork on their cars to incorporate Aboriginal art, and the cars do tend to look spectacular every year they do this. They reach a real tasteful middle ground in my opinion, where they change the cars enough so that they're special and eye-catching, but they don't overhaul the designs so much that it's hard to actually work out who is who for this one-off initiative. Darwin also plays host to the Triple Crown. This is a bit of an odd award that I've got to admit doesn't mean all that much to me as a fan, but essentially whoever dominates the weekend gets an extra trophy. Now, in order to win the Triple Crown this year, I understand the driver has to top practice oddly on the Friday and then win both races Saturday and Sunday to get the Triple Crown. One thing that is more intriguing though is the Super Soft tyre. It's the first time we're going to see Dunlop Super Soft compound this year, and in the heat of the Northern Territory it'll be interesting to see how that one impacts the racing. In terms of driver news, there's a wild card this weekend. We have an extra car on the grid run by 888 Racing, and Cooper Murray will be steering that one. He's one of the Super 2 drivers that was involved in that massive accident in Wanneroo Raceway last time out, and I'm sure he's keen to put that behind him as he makes his main game solo debut. And then finally, of course, we've got some NASCAR returnees. We had Will Brown and Cameron Waters head stateside for the event last weekend at Sonoma. Unfortunately, both of those guys involved in incidents. Will Brown showed some really good pace in practice, then suffered some technical issues. I must admit, I've only seen highlights, so I don't have the full story for you, but it will be interesting to see how they reacclimatize to the supercars. It's starting to rain here in Perth, so before that plays too much havoc with my audio, let's jump into the predictions. Now, as always, these are just a bit of fun, don't take them too seriously, but I do try to give you some logic behind them. My first prediction is a victory for Cameron Waters this weekend. A pretty safe bet, I think, given his strong momentum after the last event in WA, but also the fact he had really strong pace here last year up until the point where his Mustang spontaneously combusted a few laps into that first race. My second prediction is Bryce Fullwood, that he will get a top 6 result this weekend. This one probably not as likely, but I would certainly love to see it. Bryce has had a bit of a missing in action moment so far in 2024 after some pretty strong performances last year, so I'm sure he'll be keen to turn his season around, and what better place to do it than his hometown. And my final prediction, as always, I do throw something in there that's on the more negative side, but I've got a feeling we might see a nasty and controversial restart crash onto the main straight this year. Darwin, because of the length of its main straight, we often see the drivers trying to anticipate the go moment when they go back to green, and we've seen the field stack up with big pace differentials, and I think it's only a matter of time, sadly, before we see something nasty. Thank you as always for those of you who have submitted your own predictions. If you want to get involved in this in the future, be sure to subscribe and keep an eye out on my community tab every race week where I call for your thoughts. The first one here from Jeremy. I'm just going to do my usual thing of picking out one aspect of these predictions. And this one here, I want to shout out Ryan Wood. Jeremy's predicting another solid weekend for him, a potential podium. And yeah, that's a good shout. In fact, I wanted to put Ryan Wood in my own predictions, but I've done that way too much recently, so I thought I'd mix it up. And he was so close to his maiden podium in Perth. He was just pipped at that last corner. So it'll be interesting to see if he can go one step further this weekend. The second prediction here from Max Jones, I want to focus on Erebus, point number 5 there in his comments. Erebus are an interesting one to follow their story with the return of Kostecki over recent events. In Topor, Kostecki's first race back, they were kind of where I expected them to be. It looked like a fairly solid starting point given all that's going on, but in Perth it just all came undone. They were pretty horrendous the whole weekend with tech issues on both cars and Kostecki finding himself in a few incidents as well. So it'll be interesting to see what the next chapter is for Erebus in Kostecki's return. And yeah, fingers crossed we can see him fighting towards the front, because we know from last year, Kostecki in particular has the talent to do it. And then the last prediction here from John, also backing the Ford camp, which has being on the podium in both races. And yeah, this is an interesting one now, isn't it? It feels like Will Brown's biggest championship challenger on current form is not his teammate in Brock Feeney, who, as John says here, is experiencing a bit of a slump, but Chaz Moster, who's really picked up the momentum recently, and that team seems to be making less mistakes. So yes, a pivotal part of the championship, which brings us to the current standings. Will Brown does have a fairly solid lead out there in front, Brock Feeney behind him, but Chaz Moster, as I said, the recent charger to keep an eye out on. Same goes for Cameron Waters in 4th, Matt Pang in 5th, Nick Percat up there doing well still in 6th, Will Davidson and his teammate Anton De Pasquale in 7th and 8th. On the team side of things, Red Bull still have a pretty clear advantage. It's not as enticing as the driver side of things, unfortunately. WAU are up there in 2nd, followed by Tickford in 3rd, Penrite in 4th, Shell in 5th, and you can see some of the other teams down the ladder there. Of course, it's not just Supercars in action this weekend. We've got some great supports lined up as well. Starting off with combined sedans, which brings some great variety to the racetrack. Porsche Carrera Cup will be rocking the joint with their loud engine notes. Touring Car Masters have small grids at the moment, but as we saw in Perth, they still put on some great entertaining racing. And then finally, my personal guilty pleasure, the V8 Super Utes are also back in action and continuing to ensure that Rubbin's racing lives on in Australian motorsport. And that will bring my Darwin preview to an end. As I said, it's one of my favourite events of the year. I enjoy seeing the sunshine, I enjoy seeing the Indigenous liveries, and the track itself tends to put on some really good racing. Speaking of tracks, if you haven't seen it, I've done a video exploring potential Perth street circuit concepts. I'll leave a link to that at the end of this video. Street circuits, always a controversial topic, but I'm a big fan of the idea for Perth in particular. Until then, enjoy the racing this weekend. Keep an eye out for different polls I'll put up depending on what unfolds throughout the racing action, and I will see you in my round review in just a few days' time.